When Gene Hackman died in February 2025, he left behind something that looked, on paper, like the simplest kind of ending. 2 Oscars, 5 decades of iconic performances, and an estimated $80 million fortune, all tied up in an estate plan he had signed almost exactly 20 years earlier. He had done everything a careful man is supposed to do. He hired attorneys, he named a trustee, he put his wishes in writing, and he assumed the plan would simply execute itself when the time came. Instead, the actual outcome of his estate turned into one of the strangest real-life legal puzzles Hollywood has seen in years. And as of the most recent reporting, it still has not been fully resolved. Understanding why requires going back to a marriage most people forget, a second marriage that defined the rest of his life, and a single week in February 2025 that no lawyer could have planned around. Gene Hackman was born in 1930 in San Bernardino, California, into a household that fell apart early. His father left when Hackman was a teenager, and the actor later described the moment with a kind of flat, unromantic honesty that would come to define his whole approach to life. His father simply drove away one day and never came back. Hackman enlisted in the Marine Corps as a teenager, worked a string of ordinary jobs afterward, and eventually made his way into acting through the Pasadena Playhouse, where instructors reportedly rated him and his classmate Dustin Hoffman among the least likely students to succeed. He proved them wrong the hard way, spending years scraping by in New York before his breakout role as Buck Barrow in Bonnie and Clyde in 1967 put him on the map. For years later, the French Connection made him a star and won him his first Academy Award, and by the end of the 1970s, he had added blockbuster credibility with Superman, playing Lex Luthor opposite Christopher Reeve. His second Oscar came in 1992 for Unforgiven, a role he almost turned down. Across all of it, Hackman built a reputation as a workhorse who treated acting like a demanding, unforgiving job rather than a glamorous calling, and that reputation came with real money behind it. Long before any of that fame arrived, Hackman married his first wife, Faye Maltese, in 1956. They had 3 children together, Christopher, Elizabeth, and Leslie, and stayed married for 3 decades while Hackman's career pulled him away for long stretches at a time. The marriage ended in divorce in 1986. 5 years later, in 1991, Hackman married Betsy Arakawa, a classically trained pianist roughly 3 decades younger than him, whom he had met in California in the late 1980s. The two eventually left Los Angeles behind entirely and settled into a quiet, secluded property in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Hackman largely retired from acting after 2004, following an interview in which he mentioned to Larry King that he probably would not make any more films, and he spent his later years writing historical novels, painting, and living privately with Betsy, who by most accounts became the steady center of his life as his health declined. He was diagnosed with advanced Alzheimer's disease in his final years, and Betsy took on the role of his primary caregiver, largely shielding him from public view. In 2005, when Hackman was 75, he and Arakawa each signed updated estate planning documents. According to court filings that later became public, these were not simple, old-fashioned wills. They used a structure common among people with significant assets, a living trust, known as the Gene Hackman Living Trust, paired with what attorneys call a pour-over will. In this kind of arrangement, the trust itself, not the will, is the document that actually controls who inherits what, and the will exists mainly as a backstop that directs any remaining property into the trust when the person dies. Hackman's pour-over will named Arakawa as his estate's personal representative and directed his assets into the trust, of which she was also the successor trustee. His 3 adult children were not named as beneficiaries in the documents that have surfaced publicly. Arakawa's own will mirrored his, leaving her estate to flow toward Hackman, with a stated intention that if he did not survive her, her personal assets would instead go toward a charitable trust reflecting causes she and Hackman cared about together. On its face, the plan looked airtight, built around a very reasonable assumption that a man 3 decades older than his wife would very likely die first. That assumption did not hold. On February 26, 2025, maintenance workers at the couple's gated Santa Fe community discovered Hackman and Arakawa dead inside their home, along with one of their 3 dogs. Investigators and medical examiners spent weeks piecing together what had actually happened, and the picture that emerged was tragic rather than sinister. Arakawa had contracted hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, a rare and often fatal illness spread through exposure to rodent droppings, a recognized hazard in parts of rural New Mexico. Evidence from her phone and a medical concierge service she had contacted suggested she died around February 11th or 12th after mentioning congestion, but not reporting the kind of severe symptoms that would have signaled an emergency. Hackman, 95 years old and in an advanced stage of Alzheimer's, appears to have remained in the home for roughly a week afterward. Data from his pacemaker showed activity as late as February 18th, and the county medical examiner concluded he died of heart disease, with Alzheimer's listed as a significant contributing factor. Officials have said his cognitive decline likely explains why he never appears to have understood or been able to communicate that his wife had died. It was a devastating, almost unbearably sad way for both of their lives to end, and initial public reaction understandably included a wave of speculation and rumor before autopsy results made the true circumstances clear. It is that timeline, more than anything written in either will, that turned Hackman's estate into a genuine legal puzzle. Because Arakawa's death came first, by a matter of days rather than months, her pour-over will was triggered ahead of his. Under its terms, her personal assets were set to flow into Hackman's trust rather than out to charity, since he had technically survived her. But because Hackman's own documents named Arakawa as his sole beneficiary and successor trustee, and did not name a backup individual or contingent beneficiary to step into that role, his death created a vacancy at the center of his own estate plan. To make matters more tangled, the attorney Hackman had originally designated as a successor trustee, Michael Sutton, had died back in 2019, 6 years before Hackman himself passed away. Because Hackman's Alzheimer's had already progressed by that point, there is no indication he was ever able to update the paperwork to reflect that loss. Attorneys who reviewed the situation for outlets, including the BBC, noted that if the couple's deaths were ultimately classified as simultaneous under New Mexico law, meaning close enough in time to trigger that legal designation, the assets Hackman left to Arakawa could bypass her entirely and pass instead to his own next of kin. Later reporting indicated that the final autopsy findings placed their deaths more than 5 days apart, which meant New Mexico's simultaneous death rule technically did not apply. Even so, with no living primary beneficiary and no designated backup trustee, legal experts said the estate was at real risk of being treated, at least in part, under New Mexico's intestate succession laws, the default rules that apply when a person's estate planning fails to account for exactly this kind of scenario. Under those default rules, if a person's estate cannot be distributed according to their written wishes because the named beneficiaries are no longer living, the law typically directs the assets toward the deceased person's closest living relatives, which in Hackman's case would be Christopher, Elizabeth, and Leslie, the very children who were left out of both the 2005 will and the underlying trust. A California attorney, Trey Lovell, told the BBC that the children would likely be lawfully next in line to inherit if no other valid beneficiary could be identified. That possibility is what generated so many breathless headlines in the months after Hackman's death, framing his story as an ironic twist in which the children he spent decades keeping at arm's length stood to receive the very fortune he had structured his paperwork to keep from them. The reality, based on the public record as it stands, is more restrained and considerably less tidy than that narrative suggests. A New Mexico court-appointed Avalon Trust, a Santa Fe-based trust company, as a temporary successor trustee to manage the estate, while the underlying questions got sorted out. Since both of the people Hackman had originally chosen to handle that role, Arakawa and Sutton, were gone. Because the estate is largely structured around a private living trust rather than a straightforward will, much of it is shielded from public court records in a way that a simple inheritance dispute would not be. Legal scholars writing about the case have noted that the public may never learn the full details of how the trust ultimately gets resolved, particularly if the parties involved reach a private settlement rather than litigating everything in open court. Reports also indicated that Christopher Hackman retained his own attorney in the months following his father's death, a step commonly read as at least the possibility of a challenge to some part of the estate, though no public court filing has confirmed the outcome of any such effort. As of the most recent updates available, the fate of the $80 million estate remains genuinely unsettled, caught between the letter of two overlapping estate plans, a trust document the public has not fully seen, and default succession laws that may or may not end up applying to all of it. It is worth pausing on just how sophisticated Hackman's original planning actually was, because it undercuts the simple narrative that he made some careless, obvious mistake. Attorneys who have examined the publicly available filings have pointed out that a living trust paired with a pour-over will is a deliberate, fairly advanced strategy, the same basic structure used by other high-net-worth individuals, including Michael Jackson's estate. The advantage of that structure is privacy. Unlike a plain will, which becomes a public court document the moment it is filed for probate, a living trust can be administered quietly without a judge overseeing every distribution and without reporters combing through case files. That is precisely why so much about the Hackman estate has remained frustratingly opaque even a year after his death. The pour-over will itself was made public because Hackman's personal representative had to file it in probate court to deal with whatever property had not already been placed inside the trust during his lifetime. But the trust document, the one that actually spells out who inherits what under different scenarios, has not been released, and legal commentators have said there is a real chance it never will be if the matter is resolved through private negotiation rather than a contested court battle. That privacy also explains why the earliest coverage of Hackman and Arakawa's deaths spiraled into confusion and rumor. In the days immediately after their bodies were found, before autopsy results were available, the unusual circumstances created an information vacuum that online speculation rushed to fill. Some of that speculation grew dark, questioning whether foul play or a family dispute over money might be involved. The Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office and the State Medical Examiner's Office worked through several weeks of forensic and digital evidence, including phone records, pacemaker data, and the timeline of Arakawa's final errands and messages before publicly ruling out foul play and settling on the hantavirus and heart disease findings that are now the accepted account of what happened. It is a useful reminder that in the absence of confirmed facts, the internet will often construct the most dramatic version of events available, and that the real explanation, in this case, turned out to be a heartbreaking but entirely natural tragedy rather than anything resembling a crime. What makes the story worth telling is not a clean, satisfying twist where the excluded children triumphantly collect a fortune their father tried to deny them. It is something quieter and, in a way, more human. A reminder that even a meticulously built estate plan is only as strong as its weakest assumption. Hackman and his lawyers built a structure in 2005 that made complete sense for the future they expected, one in which a man in his 70s would predecease a wife 30 years younger. What they did not build in was flexibility for the far less likely scenario that actually occurred, in which his health,